All right. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to this webinar on an introduction to top legal issues for churches, sponsored by the Orthodox Christian Attorney Network, or OCAN. I'm Deacon Ken Liu, the director of OCAN. And if you're new to us, we are an organization of Orthodox attorneys with a threefold mission of one, bringing Orthodox attorneys together to grow in our faith and integrate it with the practice of law. Two, to encourage and train attorneys to serve the Orthodox Church. And three, to impact the world with the love of Christ. We're so glad you're here this morning. If you're an attorney and haven't joined OCAN yet, we invite you to register as an official member. This will allow you to be in our membership directory so that you can find and be found by other Orthodox attorneys around the country. And membership is currently free. And one of the benefits will be that you will get discounts to our events, including our upcoming fall retreat, which is going to be on November 21st to 23rd at the St. Jacobos Retreat Center north of Chicago. It's going to be a rejuvenating time focused on the topic of spiritual renewal for attorneys, which I know we all need. If you're not an attorney but know other Orthodox attorneys, please share the news with them so that we can connect with them. We're very pleased to offer today's webinar for CLE credit, which we hope is the first of many for all attorneys who need CLE. A little bit about myself, for those of you new. In addition to leading OCAN, I serve as the General Counsel and Senior Advisor with Orthodox Youth and Young Adult Ministries. I serve on a team of consultants to the Legal Affairs Committee of the Assembly of Orthodox Bishops, and I've been practicing nonprofit law and trademark and copyright law for over 25 years at a firm in Northern Virginia called Gammon and Grange, which serves religious entities and other nonprofits. I'm also a deacon, a new one, at St. Mary's Romanian OCA Church in Northern Virginia, where I've been on the parish council for over a decade, including 2 terms as council president. So I've seen my fair share of church legal issues. A few preliminary issues. A quick disclaimer, and this is especially for those of you who are not attorneys. I'm very excited that we have quite a few clergy and parish council members viewing this webinar. This webinar is not legal advice. It is a 30,000 foot overview of some general legal issues. It may or may not be applicable in your state or legal jurisdiction, and every issue is context specific. So if you are a church representative and have specific legal issues, please be sure to obtain your own legal counsel when making decisions on those issues. Feel free to type in any questions you have in our chat box. However, we do have a very packed list of topics we're going to cover, so I may not be able to get to all of your questions. But feel free to stick around at the end of the webinar, and I'll be glad to try and get to them then. All right. First, what exactly is the law that we need to pay attention to? There are many sources of law in our country that churches must follow. There is legislation, there is regulatory law pronounced by the agencies, such as the IRS's tax exemption regulations. There is judicial case law, such as interpretations of the First Amendment freedom of religion. And we have laws at the federal level, state level, and local levels, including important zoning and property issues. But for churches, there are also other sources of law that we need to abide by. There is Holy Scripture, canon law, and our own internal governing documents. And I'm not just saying this to sound pious. These really are law in the sense that they're normative for our parishes and dioceses. For instance, when we have disputes, we need to turn to these for guidance on how to resolve them. And because we are religious organizations, these are legally binding, more so than in secular organizations. And what do I mean by that? In the US, we're fortunate to have the First Amendment of the US Constitution, which guarantees the freedom of religion. And one key principle is that the secular government does not have authority to interfere with the internal actions and governance decisions of churches. Two very important U.S. Supreme Court cases that help to define this issue actually involve Orthodox churches. In both of these cases, the state government imposed their own decision in opposition to the church hierarchy's decision. In Kedrov versus St. Nicholas Cathedral of the Russian Orthodox Church in 1952, the state of New York passed a law ordering the transfer of the cathedral from the Moscow-controlled church to the American entity. In Serbian Eastern Orthodox Diocese versus Milojevic in 1976, the Serbian Holy Assembly of Bishops and the Synod had defrocked their bishop in the Midwest, and the bishop sued, and the Illinois State Court held that the bishop was improperly defrocked and reinstated him. But in both of these cases, the U.S. Supreme Court held that those states' actions violated the First Amendment Religious Freedom Clause because they interfered with the internal governance of the church bodies. Regardless of how you might feel about the outcomes of these cases, both of these cases were very important for helping to solidify the separation of church and state and the right of religious organizations to manage their own affairs. What this means for us is that the buck stops with the highest authority in our Orthodox jurisdictions. In Protestant, non-hierarchical churches, the buck normally stops with the local church. But in hierarchical churches, the authority is at the top of our jurisdictions. One practical implication of this is that our internal governing documents are effectively the law. And so we need to know what our own documents say. And it's often lawyers that help our parishes and leaders to know and understand our governing documents, which dictate important issues as how the church is to be operated, how we choose our leaders, who makes decisions, and how the decisions are made. And some of these documents include bylaws and constitutions and charters, articles of incorporation and organization, as well as the internal rules, regulations, and policies. One quick note about incorporation. Surprisingly, there are still a number of old parishes that are unincorporated. Without incorporation, the parish leaders can potentially be held personally liable for certain kinds of legal liabilities. So if you know of parishes that are still unincorporated, I'd suggest asking them to consider engaging a lawyer to help them to incorporate and take advantage of the protections of state incorporation. Church leaders have some basic legal obligations. One, the duty of care. In other words, the duty to act as a reasonably prudent person would in similar situations. The duty of loyalty, that is the duty to place the interests of the organization above their own personal interests. And three, the duty of obedience, the duty to ensure that the organization complies with applicable laws and carries out its mission appropriately. Practically, this means basically pay attention, do the right thing, and keep the organization out of trouble. And this applies to all leaders, parish council leaders, clergy, directors, and officers. Now, one very important legal obligation that every parish should be concerned about is the protection of youth against sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse is the #1 reason that churches are sued. And I would hope that love for our children alone would be enough to ensure their protection. But if that's not enough, sexual abuse of minors is also one of the highest monetary liability risks. Now, when decades of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church came to light in the 2000s, everyone thought that was just a Catholic thing. Then suddenly, widespread abuses in the Protestant churches came to light in the 2010s. And we might bury our heads in the sand thinking that this is just a Catholic and Protestant thing. But abuses do happen in the Orthodox Church and will continue to happen if we don't take proper procedures. a priest in a parish in 2007 was sued by two men who had been altar boys and were sexually abused. The church leadership allegedly knew of the pedophilia and covered it up. That was not only a huge scandal, but quite a disturbance. And fortunately for the church, the case was settled. But more recently, there was a diocese where it was sued for sexual abuse by a monk at a monastery. That case was settled for $250,000, but that if that wasn't enough, the legal fees ended up being more than $1.5 million. Very recently, I just learned of a woman from an Orthodox family who was sexually abused repeatedly from age 3 to 15. She grew up ashamed and alone, feeling like God didn't care about her until finally she joined a Protestant church that helped her with the emotional and spiritual healing. And I wonder, why did she not get that kind of healing from the Orthodox church that she grew up in? This is an extremely serious issue. Now, fortunately, um, the three largest jurisdictions, the OCA, the GOA, and just recently the Antiochian Archdiocese, have all adopted national policies on youth protection. And I'm privileged to say that OCAN and Orthodox Youth Ministries helped the Antiochian Archdiocese to implement that, and along in collaboration with a volunteer leader in the Archdiocese who is also an OCAN member. If you are in one of the smaller jurisdictions that don't yet have a national youth protection policy, please talk to your hierarchs and encourage them to take up this issue. I'm happy to help, and I've been reaching out to several of the jurisdictions, but many of the jurisdictions need just a little bit of nudging to move forward on this issue. Uh, for the lawyers in the room, there are several grounds on which churches can be held liable for sexual abuse. It's negligent hiring, negligent supervision, and negligent retention after seeing evidence of risk. To address the risk at all three stages of a potential perpetrator's affiliation with a church, we need to have these proper policies and actually abide by them. So the key aspects of a youth protection program are, first, doing criminal background checks of church leaders and youth ministry workers. Two, doing youth protection training on how to prevent sexual misconduct. Three, having a code of conduct for how youth ministry workers are to behave around youth. And then finally, have a general best practices for proactive, protective parish activities. And one of the most important of those best practices is always having at least two adults in all parish activities. Uh, we actually did a more comprehensive webinar on this topic already. If you would like to learn more, please go to our website and find our earlier webinar on this issue of youth protection. All right. Um, Mandatory abuse reporting. This is in conjunction with the topic of youth protection. Almost all states designate certain people in certain professions as mandatory reporters who are legally obligated to report to legal authorities any reasonable suspicion of child abuse. And a majority of states designate clergy as mandatory reporters. Some states designate all adults as mandatory reporters. Uh, if you would like specific information on your state, here are two websites that you can go to find the specific laws in your state. Um, Mandatory reporters who fail to report any evidence, reasonable suspicion of child abuse to state legal authorities can face criminal prosecution, civil penalty, or both. And so this is a very serious issue, not only internally, but for the protection of our leaders. Now, somewhat of a dilemma when it comes to this issue is priests who receive information about child abuse during a perpetrator's confession. Priests are caught between the legal duty to report and the canonical duty to maintain the confidentiality of information obtained in confession. Historically, every state made certain communications to clergy privileged, which meant that neither the minister nor the penitent could be forced to reveal or testify about the information if it was disclosed during communication protected by clergy penitent privilege. But this protection is becoming increasingly weakened. Some states now merely provide that information protected by the clergy penitent privilege is not admissible in legal proceedings regarding the alleged abuse, but must be disclosed. Some reporting statutes don't list a clergy exemption at all in the context of child abuse proceedings. But the worst is a new Washington state law that makes it a crime for clergy not to report child abuse, even for information revealed during confession. And what's extremely unfair is that the law exempts information obtained by attorneys within the attorney-client communication, despite making it a crime for clergy not to report that information. A lawsuit challenging this new law was recently filed by the OCA, the Antiochian Archdiocese, the Romania Orthodox Metropolia, Rocor Western Diocese, and Father Timothy Wilkinson of St. Luke Church in OCA Diocese of the West. After just having discussed the importance of youth protection, we, of course, believe in the necessity of laws that protect our kids from abuse, but violating the ancient sacrament of confession is not the way to do it and can even backfire. I don't have the time to get into this issue deeper, but one of our OCON members is actually speaking on this issue at the Orthodox Canon Law Society Conference in October, which we have a collaboration with. So if you are interested in learning more about this issue, we welcome you to check out that conference. It's going to be at Holy Cross, HCHC in Boston. All right, now let's talk about something a little bit more lighthearted. If you have a situation where a volunteer finds a photo of happy volunteers on the web and they add it to a priest's newsletter articles on service to others, and then he posts the photo to the article on the church website to edify the faithful. Is there anything wrong with that? This is a very common scenario, right? I wouldn't be surprised if all of your parishes have done that. Well, in a situation like that, 3 years later, the church can receive a cease and desist letter from a law firm demanding $1,500 for copyright infringement for the use of the photo. Sound outrageous? Yes, but unfortunately, this scenario is all too common, including among Orthodox parishes, and it can be legitimate. To save your parish is a big headache and possibly thousands of dollars. Let me give you a basic primer on copyright law. So, copyright protects all creative works from the moment of creation, and that includes photos, music, text, artwork, and no one is allowed to copy or reuse the work without the owner's permission. This is true even if you're a nonprofit who uses the work for non-commercial purposes. But the freedom of the internet lulls people into this state of complacency, thinking that, well, if it's on the internet, I must be able to copy and use it, right? Uh, Now, this didn't used to be a huge problem. But with the advent of powerful image searching software, it is easy for copyright owners these days, including copyright trolls, to scour the web and send nasty cease and desist letters, demanding thousands of dollars from innocent infringers. And what I mean by a copyright troll is there are companies out there whose sole business is to find copyright owners who have copyrighted materials that might be stolen, help them scour the internet, and then very aggressively demand from innocent users literally thousands of dollars. Um, and unfortunately, it can be legitimate. It's very aggressive, but it can be legitimate if the copyright owner actually owns what they purport to. And the law allows copyright owners to recover statutory damages between $750 to $30,000 per work infringed. That means potentially even just infringement of one single photo could result in $30,000 of damages. Fortunately, it's rare to be that high, but even a demand of $1,000 for use of a single photo on your website is not worth the savings of using free images that you pluck off the internet. So, what are churches supposed to do? Here's a few tips. One, use only properly licensed images. There are a number of free sources on the web. I use one called pixabay.com. There are many paid sources, but one of the biggest ones is called gettyimages.com. With these stock photo agencies, typically the use of a photo might cost about $15. Added up, over the course of a few years, yeah, it might feel like a lot of money, but think of it as insurance against receiving a nasty cease and desist letter. You can have volunteers take photos for you. You can go and ask permission from the original copyright owner of an image, the image that you want to use. You can use public domain images. Now, public domain means that the copyright has expired. There's some complicated laws and timing of figuring out when copyright expires. As a general rule of thumb, you can assume that anything over 100 years old is in the public domain. And what that means is that any historic images, including icons that are over 100 years old, are likely public domain. And yes, iconography, even though they are windows into heaven, are also protected by worldly copyright law. Now, fortunately, most iconographers are not going to be, very aggressive in challenging churches' use of their images, but just so you know, they are protected by copyright. Um, yes, we have a comment in the chat. The issue of taking photos of parishioners and using those photos without their consent. That is actually a very important issue as well. So every person has both a right of privacy and a right of publicity, which they can assert to avoid their images from being used publicly without their permission. Now, the general rule of thumb that I use is if you are taking a picture of a large group of people and an individual person is featured in it, and it's in a public place, generally you're probably safe. Where you get into trouble is if you start highlighting individual people up close. and then you post those images without their permission, especially if you use it in a context that the person might be offended by. So, you want to make sure avoid using people's images with anything that might be controversial, like any politically motivated websites. And a lot of people get offended if they see their images being used for commercial purposes. And commercial purposes does not just mean for profit. Seeking donations can also be a challenge as being a commercial purposes. So thanks for raising that issue. Um, Oh, you can also use AI images. The image of the copyright troll that I used in my previous slide was created by artificial intelligence. They're not great, but that is one safe way because images created by artificial intelligence are not protectable by copyright, at least under the current interpretation, but that could change anytime. Some of you may have heard of a concept called the fair use doctrine, which allows people to use certain copyrighted works for limited purposes. Some of those purposes include educational news reporting and criticism of the work. Unfortunately, the fair use doctrine is extremely complicated. It's very arbitrary. The only way to know that something really is fair use is if you get sued and a judge says it's fair use. So I would not rely on the doctrine of fair use unless you have an attorney who actually walks you through the analysis. You're not going to do that for every single newsletter. So please heed some of these practices and stay safe. Let's talk about the next issue. Second to sexual misconduct, personal injury is also one of the highest issues in which churches are pegged with large monetary liability. So let's say if your church has a festival and rents a giant bouncy house and a child gets injured, can the church be held liable? Well, the short answer is yes. Your church very well could be held liable. There are several different grounds on which churches can be held liable for personal injuries occurring on their premises. For instance, general negligence if the church failed to exercise reasonable care, example in setting up the bouncy house, or failure to properly supervise its use, and this failure led to the injury. Yes, the church can be held liable. What about if there's, let's say, a broken seesaw, that's been sitting on the church ground for years, and so some kid from the neighborhood comes, can the church be held liable? Yes, if there are known hazards on your grounds and you fail to remedy it, or you fail to provide some kind of notice, like a big sign, do not use this playground, the church can be held liable for injuries on the property. So some things that you want to be sure to do is to inspect your facilities regularly for hazards, correct problems promptly, warn people of known hazards, and definitely provide adequate supervision of activities. So if you do decide to rent a bouncy house, make sure you have people who know, the inherent hazards of those kinds of activities and provide adequate supervision. If you have a big church festival with hundreds of kids, make sure you have enough supervision. All right. And what if it is an activity that happens off-site? For instance, a church's moms group that meets at someone's house and a child is injured on that family's trampoline. That could also potentially result in liability for the church. So there was a pretty horrific case where a family with students at a church-operated high school invited other students to a year-end party at their house. Two students on the way to the party drank alcohol, collided with a tree. One of them died and one of them was paralyzed. The paralyzed victim and his family sued the school, the diocese, the principal, and the family who hosted the party. The plaintiff settled with the school principal for $1.1 million. The court awarded $13 million against the school and the diocese. This was under a comparative negligence analysis. The jury apportioned 53% of the negligence to the plaintiffs, but 25% to the school and 25% to the family. Um, and so you do have to be careful about activities that happen off-site. Now, it's not the case that any party, any activity that happens with church people is necessarily going to result in liability for the church. Generally, liability will be found if the church can be deemed to have sponsored the event somehow. And typically that means, of course, if the church actually organized the event, or they gave some money to support the event, or they advertised the event, and that could be even something as simple as just mentioning it in a church newsletter, or putting it on a calendar, or if church leaders attend the event. So you have the imprimatur of the church at the activity. Let's go to another important issue that can result in liability for the church, embezzlement. Uh, Embezzlement can happen to any church. Um, Strict controls need to be in place for finances. One thing that can be done is to first check the backgrounds of those who have access to finances. Um, and then more importantly is to implement financial controls that build in protections against embezzlement. Um, Many churches are uncomfortable with implementing basic internal controls out of a fear of offending persons who might feel that they are being suspected of misconduct. But the issue here is not hurt feelings, it is one of accountability. What you want to do before you implement these is explain the reasoning behind these policies. And if there's still anyone who feels offended, well, that's more of a reason to impose the controls and be on the lookout for this person. Uh, the temptation can ensnare anyone, even people at the top. And these controls protect each of us from the snare of the devil who would like to uh, tear down a church, based on one bad apple. So what are some things that churches can do? The most important thing is to have a division of responsibilities. The more that tasks and responsibilities involving finances are shared or divided, the less risk there will be of embezzlement. For example, if you still pass around a cash offering plate, make sure you have two people count the cash together. You should have different people authorize expenses from those who make the expenses. Uh, do regular reviews of expenditures, ideally by an outsider, like an outside accountant. And then periodically rotate the authorized people who have access to funds. Whoops. Okay, let's go on to another issue of property. Um, oh, sorry. Looks like some of my slides are slightly out of order here. All right, let's talk about public accommodation of property. Um, Uh, Many states and cities now prohibit certain kinds of discrimination by places of public accommodation. Uh, and public accommodation means that places that are open to the public or provide some kind of service to the public. Churches are generally excluded from the definition of place of public accommodation. In other words, they are generally exempt from those kinds of discrimination laws, but those exemptions often do not apply when a church rents its property out to the general public. So if you have a rental hall and you rent it out for weddings and other events, that could turn your church, or at least the rental aspect of it, into a public accommodation. And so those are issues that you need to be aware of. Um, One thing that, sorry, another issue regarding outside uses of your property is that churches may be legally responsible for injuries occurring on the premises while you are renting the facility to an outside group. And one of the determinants of whether you could be held liable is if you are asserting any kind of control over the property. So for example, if you actually do the setup of the tables and chairs, if you are providing the cleanup services, the more you are involved in providing services to the outside user, the more likely you could be held responsible for injuries. It might seem kind of ironic, but that is the general analysis. So what are some ways that you can minimize risk? One, have a rental application. You want to have an application so you can see what are the planned activities. If somebody's going to rent the property for a college graduation party for 20 somethings that are serving alcohol, okay, maybe you don't want to do that. Have a rental agreement that puts boundaries on what your renters can do, that disclaims liability. You want to have rules and usage guidelines. And then, of course, you do want liability insurance. All right, speaking of insurance, what are the types of insurance that a church should have? You want to have general liability that protects against personal injury, um, property damage, etc. You definitely want to have directors and officers insurance that protects your leaders, including parish council members, from any potentially acts that are deemed to be wrongful. You need workers' compensation if you have paid employees. Uh, Sexual misconduct is a relatively new and important form of insurance that is often excluded from general liability. So that's one thing that you want to watch out for. If it is excluded from your policy, you'll want to get a rider specifically for sexual misconduct. Uh, and you might want to get umbrella coverage, which is coverage that's above and beyond all of your other policies. One thing you want to do is review your insurance policies every few years to consider whether your coverage is adequate, and make sure that if you ever do have any incident that could potentially result in liability, call the insurance carrier promptly. Generally, insurance carriers are there to help you, and by communicating with them promptly, they may be able to help you prevent liability, take steps to prevent liability. So don't wait until you think that, oh, somebody is going to sue us. Contact them right away if there is even a potential. And if you have a lawyer, obviously you want to speak to them as well. Um, One quick note, well, let me say that to the end. about use of lawyers. All right, taxes. Let's talk a little bit about taxes. Churches, of course, are tax-exempt entities, which means they are generally exempt from income taxes, so they don't have to pay taxes on the tithes and offerings that they receive. But being tax-exempt does not mean that you don't have to pay any taxes. One potential form of tax that churches might have to pay is unrelated business income tax. Federal law imposes an income tax on nonprofits if they generate income from activities that are unrelated to their ministry. Congress imposed this tax to eliminate the unfair competition between nonprofits and for-profit businesses. And the fact that an organization uses the income to further its charitable or ministry purposes alone does not make the activity substantially related. Let me give some examples. Well, first, the definition of an unrelated business income is any revenue generating activity that constitutes a business, is regularly carried on, and is not substantially related to the organization's exempt purposes. What about church festivals? Obviously, this is a big one in the Orthodox Church. There are churches that do make quite a substantial amount of money from them. Are they unrelated business income subject to the UBIT tax? Well, one of the key factors will be, are they regularly carried on? Now, I think most parishes probably do festivals once a year. I think once a year is probably not deemed to be regular activity, but what if you start doing it 2, 3, or even 4 times a year? Well, then you're starting to, get into the definition of regular. I'm not aware of any IRS cases on this. I don't think they're in the business of going after churches for festivals, but you do need to be careful. There are also other kinds of activities that might be more likely to be deemed to be unrelated business income. So let's say you have a bookstore. Now, if it's an internal bookstore and you're merely selling religious books, that's not an issue. But what if you have a public bookstore open to the public and you start selling non-religious books? Then suddenly you might be edging towards unrelated business income. Or some churches have like an annual Christmas tree sale. Now that is a yearly thing, but it's a yearly thing because it only happens at Christmas time. So you are competing against businesses that sell Christmas trees. So that might be more likely to be deemed to be unrelated business income. What about rental property? This is a big one. If you own a church hall and you rent it out, well, fortunately, income received from the rental of real property is generally not considered to be unrelated business income. However, there is an exception and then an exception to the exception. The exception is if your church is borrowing money to fund the rental property, then that rental income may be deemed to be unrelated business income. However, if at least 85% of the property is used for purposes substantially related to your religious purposes, then that would be exempt. This is a highly technical issue, very confusing. If your church is in the business of renting out its hall, I suggest that you have a tax attorney or CPA help you to analyze this. Another issue is local property tax. Recently, a church in Lansing, Michigan, a few years ago, was gifted some property, but the church hadn't decided what to do with it, and they just left it vacant for several years. Localities, of course, want to maximize revenue and generate productive uses of land. So it declared the property not tax exempt, and the church racked up a $123,000 tax bill because they left it sitting vacant. So if your church owns property that is sitting vacant, make sure you actually use it for some church-related purpose. Here's a tricky issue, cash gifts to clergy, which, of course, Orthodox parishes do a lot. Cash gifts that are given directly to clergy are generally not tax deductible. All income to clergy from the church is taxable income to the clergy. So those are two important principles to keep in mind. In order to properly give tax-deductible receipts to donations to clergy, the donations must be provided to the church, not directly from individuals to the clergy. And the funds cannot be a straight pass-through. The church must determine an amount that it wants to give as a compensation bonus, because the church is responsible for determining that any employee's total compensation has to be reasonable. Yeah, so if your clergy is only making $65,000 a year in salary, but it collects another $100,000 in gifts, that could potentially be deemed to be unreasonable. All right. I wanted to give just a few points about use of attorneys. I think probably every parish in the country above a certain number of people has attorneys in their congregation, in their parish, and they are often sought out to serve on the parishes, parish council, or to give some informal advice. When you have attorneys in your parish, please do not treat them as the parish legal counsel. Okay, if you want formal legal counsel, you need to engage legal counsel. Even if the attorneys is willing to do work pro bono, you still want to make sure that they are actually acting as official legal counsel to the parish. When you have attorneys who are on the parish council or just willing to give you some, limited advice, they can help to spot legal issues or to do limited research. And so one of the purposes of this webinar is to help attorneys to be able to spot important legal issues. But as I gave a disclaimer at the beginning of this webinar, the same applies to attorneys who just give some kind of off-the-cuff advice. If you have specific issues that you need some help on, it is always wise to hire official legal counsel. And of course, attorneys on your parish council can help you to find them. Outside attorneys, it's helpful to have prior relationships if you can, rather than wait until you have an emergency. But if you have relationships with other Orthodox attorneys, don't assume that they can or should serve pro bono to the church just because they're Orthodox. Okay, you wouldn't assume that a plumber or a contractor would necessarily give pro bono work. So please don't assume that Orthodox attorneys can give pro bono work just because they're Orthodox either. So that brings this overview to a conclusion. If anyone has any questions, I would be glad to take some questions.
Run across the problem with parishes that instead of obtaining their own 501c3 certification are trying to piggyback on a 501c3 certification from their archdiocese?
That's a really good question. There, that is certainly permissible. And in fact, I know that that happens in a number of jurisdictions. So under the US Constitution, First Amendment, because we have freedom of religion, churches are not required to apply for tax exemption. We are automatically tax exempt. Now, a lot of parishes decide to apply for official IRS recognition anyways, because you run into a lot of people who don't, a lot of businesses who don't understand, what do you mean you're 501c3? If prove it to me. And so a lot of times it's easier just to apply, especially if you're a big church and you're entering into a lot of business deals and transactions with contractors or whatever. But that is a very fact and context specific issue. So you really don't want to just make any generalizations on that. That is an issue that would be helpful to at least speak with your jurisdiction's general counsel, because that's an issue that is going to be dependent on the unique relationship between diocese and individual parishes. I want to thank everyone for participating in this. It's wonderful to have a good mix of attorneys and non-attorneys on this call. But for the attorneys, we are planning to do a series of CLEs on various issues, including the ones I talked about today in more in depth. If you have experience on any issues that churches need help on, we would welcome you to contact us, and we can talk about offering CLE credit. This is one way that we can serve parishes with our legal skills. So thank you all so much for attending this. And if this was a live in-person event, typically the speaker would hang around and people can come up and chat. So what I like to do is leave it open. We will officially close this meeting, but if you want to hang around and chat and ask any questions, feel free to do so. I'll stick around for a while.